The room smelled faintly of lilies and perfume, sharp and antiseptic against the hum of soft conversation. I sat at the edge of the reception hall, my hands folded over my clutch, invisible. They were all laughing, but I could hear the thin edge of cruelty in it. The way my sister leaned toward her friends, calling me the failure, her eyes glinting with that practiced amusement. My fiancé smiled politely, not noticing, or choosing not to, how her words landed. I said nothing, nodded, smiled when expected. Beneath my quiet, I was watching. Every gesture, every hidden glance, I knew something was off, something that would matter. And yet everyone assumed I hadn't noticed a thing. I woke to the quiet hum of the apartment, sunlight slanting across the floorboards in long, thin lines. It was a Sunday morning, the kind that felt ordinary enough to trust. The coffee machine gurgled in the kitchen, the sound steady, predictable, and I let it fill the silence. I moved carefully, as I always did, aware that the apartment belonged not only to me, but to the rhythm I had cultivated, quiet, unobtrusive, contained. My sister had always been louder, more urgent, but I never minded. She could fill a room with energy. I preferred shadows. I had learned early that observation carried a kind of power that shouting never could. While she laughed in corners, I noticed patterns. The way her friends leaned in when she spoke, the careful timing of her jokes, the way she made herself the center of everything, including pain she caused. I had always known she would leave me behind, in small ways, and yet I trusted her to be consistent. The morning unfolded in routine. I checked my messages, made my bed with precision, allowed a single window to remain open so the city sounds could enter without overwhelming. My fiancé called just long enough to say he loved me, that he would see me later for brunch. His tone was warm, familiar, the kind that reassured without insisting. I trusted him in ways I did not trust anyone else, because he had never given me reason not to, at least not yet. Breakfast was silent. Toast browned too quickly in the toaster, and I retrieved it carefully, placing it on the plate with the precision that had become second nature. I sipped coffee slowly, letting the bitter warmth fill the hollow spaces in my chest. My life at this point was predictable enough to trust, safe enough to allow myself small luxuries. The newspaper, a single song on repeat, a moment of quiet before the rest of the day intruded. Later, I walked to the florist to pick up lilies for the table. I liked the ritual, the smell of damp stems, the gentle snap of pruning shears. The woman at the counter smiled at me, recognizing my silence, understanding without speaking that I preferred order to chaos. I paid, left, carried the bouquet home, arranging them with care. Life, I told myself, could be beautiful in the details. That belief had carried me through more than one disappointment, though I did not know it yet. When my sister called, I paused at the door, the lilies balanced carefully in my hands. She asked about the wedding, about how I felt. I spoke calmly, lightly, trusting that honesty would suffice. "It's fine," I said. "Everything is fine." My voice betrayed nothing, and that was intentional. She laughed, a short, sharp sound, and said something that made my chest tighten, but I dismissed it. Perhaps she was joking. Perhaps I was imagining things. That was my usual response, to trust in the surface truth, to hold back suspicion until it was warranted. The day passed in small movements, unnoticed by most. I arranged the apartment, checked emails, allowed the sunlight to shift across the floors in quiet rhythms. My fiancé visited briefly, kissed my forehead, left. I watched him leave with the same calm observation I had cultivated all my life. Trust, I had learned, was not reckless. It was quiet. It was measured. I had chosen whom to trust, and I had chosen to trust him. Evening came, and I prepared for my sister's wedding, aware of my own quiet presence in contrast to the anticipated spectacle. I dressed simply, letting elegance exist without demanding attention. The mirror reflected someone calm, restrained, someone who understood that being underestimated could be a strength. My sister would take the stage, and I would be at the edge, quiet, watching, learning. The thought was soothing. I trusted my ability to read the room, to notice what others missed, to catalog every gesture for later reflection. I did not yet know that trust could be weaponized against me. That the familiar patterns I relied upon, the careful observation, the restrained reactions, the silence I had mastered, would not protect me from the subtle cruelty already in motion. But for now, in this ordinary world, trust was all I had. It carried me through breakfast, through sunlight and the hum of the city, through the comfort of routine. I did not yet see the fault lines forming beneath the surface, but I could sense their shadow, faint and distant. I would learn soon enough how fragile trust could be, and how quietly betrayal could arrive. The first hint came in a glance. I noticed it in the photographs my sister had posted from her bridal shower. The way her friends leaned in toward her, their laughter tight, rehearsed, their eyes flicking past me as if I were a shadow on the wall. My sister smiled brightly, but her hand lingered on my shoulder for only a fraction of a second before moving on. I told myself it was nothing, that perhaps I was reading too much into a photograph. Yet an unease settled in my chest, quiet and persistent. The day before the wedding rehearsal, I arrived at the hotel early. My sister had insisted on handling the arrangements herself, despite my offer to help. I watched her coordinate the staff, her tone brisk but practiced, masking irritation with a forced cheerfulness. One of the assistants tripped over a cord, and my sister's smile tightened. She corrected him sharply, then turned to me, saying lightly, "You'll see, it's all under control. Don't worry your little head." The words stung, though they were soft. They carried a subtle judgment, a reminder that I was somehow beneath notice. I nodded and stepped aside, quiet as always. Later, during the rehearsal, I noticed small things, tiny inconsistencies that tugged at the edges of my attention. My sister's fiancé avoided meeting my gaze at certain moments, his smile faltering when I looked. One of her bridesmaids whispered something to her, just out of earshot, and my sister laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. I felt the familiar tension creep along my spine, the way one feels before lightning splits the sky, aware of something dangerous, but uncertain where it would strike. During a pause in the rehearsal, I excused myself to the lobby. The hotel smelled faintly of polish and flowers. I sat quietly, sipping water, letting my mind trace the patterns of the day. I replayed conversations in my head, searching for reason, searching for explanation. Everything could be innocent, I told myself. Perhaps I was imagining things. Perhaps the discomfort was mine alone. And yet I could not shake the sense that something was already misaligned. The next morning, I overheard a fragment of a conversation while retrieving linens. My sister was speaking on the phone in a low, hurried voice. Words like, "Don't tell her," and "she can't know" drifted through the door. I froze, heart tightening, but when I entered the room, she laughed as if nothing had happened. "I was just joking," she said, her eyes glinting. I nodded, said nothing. That was my way: observe, catalog, remain restrained. The unease in me grew, but I refused to let it spill over into confrontation. During the welcome dinner, I noticed the subtle hierarchy of attention. My sister's friends gravitated toward each other, speaking in rapid bursts, while I remained at the edge of their orbit. My fiancé seemed distracted, answering phone calls quickly, glancing around as if trying to maintain calm amidst currents I could not yet name. I trusted him to be present, but there was a slight disconnect between the reality I observed and the reassurance he offered. Still, I dismissed it, attributing it to nerves, to the complexity of events. That night in my hotel room, I went through the itinerary for the following day. Everything was meticulously organized, but I noticed slight anomalies. Guest names out of alphabetical order, small notes scribbled in margins, a few phone numbers I didn't recognize. It was enough to make the room feel colder, as though the walls themselves had grown watchful. I felt a quiet tension, a pulse beneath the surface that demanded acknowledgement. I could not yet name it. I could only feel it. Sleep came fitfully. I lay in bed, listening to the distant murmur of voices in the hall, the click of heels on tile, the low rumble of traffic beyond the windows. My mind circled around the fragments I had collected, glances that lingered too long, whispers that were not meant for me, laughter that seemed sharpened, edged. Each detail, insignificant alone, compounded into a sense of misalignment that I could not ignore. By morning, the feeling had settled into my chest, heavy and quiet. I dressed carefully, choosing muted tones that would not attract attention, allowing myself to blend into the background. Observation was my strength, but the early discomfort had planted a seed of doubt that would grow. I trusted the surface of things, but beneath it, I felt the faint tremor of something concealed, a current moving against the calm rhythm I relied upon. I had not yet confronted it. I had only noticed it. And in that noticing, I understood that the world around me might not be as stable as I had always assumed. The morning of the rehearsal dinner arrived in a blur of soft light and hotel clamor. I moved through the lobby with quiet precision, taking note of who lingered and who avoided eye contact. My sister appeared from behind a pillar, radiant in her carefully chosen dress, but her smile faltered for a fraction of a second when she saw me. That fraction would not have registered with most, but I caught it. I had spent years learning to read what others tried to conceal, and it felt like a warning I could not yet name. The first red flag was small. A table assignment had been changed without notice. The name cards had been shifted, and I ended up sitting at the edge of a table with people I barely knew. My sister passed by, paused, then smiled tightly, saying, "It's fine, you'll like your table." Her tone was polite, but the undercurrent was unmistakable, a subtle dismissal, as if my placement had been inconsequential to her carefully curated scene. I noted it silently, filing the detail away. During the introductions, one of her colleagues leaned over and whispered something that made her laugh. She looked past me as though I were not present, and for a moment the room seemed smaller, tighter, controlled by someone else's energy. I forced myself to focus on my own notes, my own perception, resisting the instinct to respond, to demand recognition. That restraint was deliberate. It allowed me to observe without revealing alarm, even as a tension curled quietly in my chest. A few moments later, I noticed my fiancé's expression shift when a particular guest approached. There was a subtle exchange, eyes narrowing, a quick tilt of the head that could have meant nothing. But I remembered the fragments of conversations I had overheard the day before, the whispered warnings, the phrases meant to be hidden. My gut tightened. I could no longer dismiss the small disturbances as trivial. Later, as I walked to the restroom, I overheard two bridesmaids talking near the lounge. Their voices were hushed but sharp with amusement. "She'll never notice, she's too quiet. Let's keep it that way." My steps faltered, but I stayed in the shadow of a doorway, listening. They had not realized I was near, and I catalogued each word, storing them with the meticulous care that had always been my method. The laughter that followed was soft, but it carried an edge I recognized, a sense of complicity, of planning, of exclusion. Returning to the table, I noticed my sister texting rapidly, her fingers moving with an intensity that suggested urgency. Her fiancé glanced at the screen once, then looked away quickly. Their reactions were subtle, but the timing of each gesture created a pattern I could not ignore. I felt the faint pulse of something hidden, something deliberate, shaping the room in ways I had yet to understand fully. The evening unfolded with the same rhythm: smiles, laughter, small adjustments, whispered corrections. I observed how attention shifted, who received it, who was deliberately ignored. My sister's control was evident, not through speech or raised voice, but in the subtle orchestration of gestures, glances, and placement. I noticed it all, cataloged it, and stayed restrained, because my instinct had always been that reaction could disrupt observation. I could see the first cracks forming in what I had assumed was a stable pattern. The next red flag came in the form of a small, seemingly innocuous note slipped under my plate. It was brief, written in a hurried hand. "Don't trust what you see tonight." My fingers hovered over the paper for a moment, heart tightening. I looked around, searching for the sender, but no one met my gaze. I folded the note silently and tucked it into my clutch. The warning was indirect, subtle, but its presence confirmed that my unease was no longer imagined. By the end of the dinner, the pattern was unmistakable. I was aware of the hierarchy of attention, the subtle alliances, the deliberate omissions. I had spent my life noticing what others overlooked, trusting my observation over words, and now my instincts screamed that trust alone would not protect me. Something was happening beneath the surface, something orchestrated, and I was already at the edge of it, watching. I returned to my room later, reviewing every movement, every glance, every half smile and half laugh of the evening. Each fragment created a map I could follow, a trail that would not be obvious to anyone else. For the first time, I understood that the world I thought I knew, the trust, the routine, the predictable gestures, was not as stable as I had assumed. Red flags were rising, and I had no choice but to observe, restrained, silent, and vigilant. The morning after the rehearsal dinner began quietly, but the tension from the night lingered like a faint ache. I moved through the hotel room, arranging my belongings with care, noting every minor detail: the position of the chair, the slight crease in the tablecloth, the way the sunlight fell differently across the floor. Patterns mattered. Observation mattered. But now I also carried unease, a low, persistent weight that refused to be named. When I joined my sister in the dining area for breakfast, she smiled brightly, but her tone had changed. It carried a subtle edge, as if she were testing me, probing for any sign that I had noticed the earlier irregularities. "You look tired," she said lightly, stirring her coffee. "Don't let the stress get to you." Her words were meant to dismiss concern, to frame any discomfort I felt as weakness. I nodded, carefully neutral, refusing to betray the tightening in my chest. During the morning preparations, I noticed subtle inconsistencies in her behavior. A guest would approach, and she would pivot, laughing, steering the conversation in a direction I could not anticipate. When my fiancé excused himself to take a call, she turned to me with a slight smirk and said, "I know you're probably imagining things, but everything's fine. Don't overthink." It was casual, almost kind, but it carried an unmistakable implication. My perception was flawed, unreliable, a product of my own anxious mind. Later, I overheard a fragment of conversation that solidified the unease I had been holding. One of her friends was whispering, almost too quietly, "She doesn't notice, does she?" My sister chuckled softly, the kind of laughter that hides intent. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, one I had learned to identify as a warning. But when I approached them, casually, asking a question about the schedule, they all looked at me as if I had misheard, misinterpreted, Imagine the exchange entirely. Their smiles were polite but dismissive. I left without confrontation, cataloging the words in my mind. By mid-morning, the gaslighting became more direct. A small discrepancy about the rehearsal dinner seating came up in conversation. I asked my sister about it, gently, almost as if to confirm a detail. She laughed, almost dismissively. "I think you're remembering wrong," she said. "Everything was exactly as planned. You probably just misread the table cards." The ease of her delivery implied that my perception was faulty. I felt the tightening in my chest deepen. I knew what I had seen, I had noticed. But now I was being made to doubt it. Even my fiancé's reactions were shifting. When I mentioned the whispered conversations I had overheard, he brushed it off. "You're too sensitive," he said, his voice calm, measured. "It's probably nothing." His dismissal carried weight because I trusted him, always had, but now that trust felt fragile. I observed him quietly, noting the slight hesitation in his eyes, the way he avoided holding my gaze for more than a heartbeat. It was subtle, but it registered, a shift in the dynamic that I had not anticipated. The afternoon carried a growing intensity, though on the surface, everything appeared ordinary. My sister's laughter, the polished greetings, the orchestrated movements of her friends, they masked a careful manipulation. Every gesture was a small assertion of control, every word a test of my restraint. When I attempted to clarify minor details with hotel staff, they smiled, nodded, and confirmed her version of events. I realized quietly that the system itself was aligned against me. The staff, the guests, even those I trusted implicitly were caught in the undercurrent of her influence. By the time I retreated to my room, I could feel the weight of dismissal pressing against me. I cataloged every interaction, every word, every laugh that carried hidden meaning. The gaslighting was precise, subtle, and deliberate. I was made to doubt myself, even as the evidence of manipulation existed in plain sight. My observation, my restraint, my patience were the only shields I had, but even they felt inadequate against the quiet, pervasive force at work. I sat by the window, tracing the patterns of the hotel courtyard below, noting the angles, the light, the way shadows fell. I understood, with a calm that belied the tightening in my chest, that trust alone would not protect me. My perception was valid, even if no one else would acknowledge it. And the dismissal, the quiet, controlled invalidation of my instincts would be the first of many tests. Even in restraint, I felt the cost. The tension in my body, the unacknowledged fear, the creeping isolation, it was all real. Yet I did not speak, did not confront, did not react. I cataloged. I observed. I waited. Because I had learned long ago that power was rarely in what could be shouted or demanded. It was in systems, in witnesses, in the quiet sway of perception. And now, for the first time, I felt that quiet power being wielded against me. The day of the wedding arrived like a quiet storm. The hotel corridors hummed with preparation, yet beneath the polished surfaces and polite smiles, I could feel the undercurrent of intention. I moved carefully through the spaces I had memorized, the lobby, the floral arrangements, the mirrors in the hallways, tracking every detail, every glance that shifted slightly when I entered the room. Observation had always been my strength, and now it became the only shield I had. It began with a fleeting glimpse of her phone, left momentarily on the reception desk. The screen glowed with messages that were partially visible, fragments like, "Make sure she doesn't see," and "He already knows." My fingers itched to reach for it, to pull the truth into my grasp, but I stayed still. I memorized the words. I traced the trajectory of the conversation in my mind. Even partial exposure was enough to hint at the betrayal I had feared, and it sent a cold certainty through me. Later, While helping a staff member arrange chairs, I overheard a conversation between one of my sister's friends and a hotel employee. "Just keep her distracted," the friend said. The employee nodded, hesitating, and I caught the slight quiver in their voice, a hesitation I recognized as a conscience wrestling with obedience. I filed every word. Every inflection mattered. The system itself, once neutral, was now participating in the subtle orchestration of my exclusion, my erasure. During the bridal rehearsal, I noticed more inconsistencies. My sister's laughter seemed rehearsed in certain moments, directed at people who were already aligned with her. Her fiancé's eyes darted occasionally to corners of the room I could not see, avoiding certain interactions as though he too was caught in a web I had yet to untangle. My trust in him wavered slightly, not because of malice, but because of omission, because silence was being wielded against me. Observation was all that remained. By mid-afternoon, evidence began to accumulate in forms too concrete to ignore. A guest who had witnessed one of the whispered exchanges approached me subtly. Their glance carried the weight of confirmation. "I didn't know if I should say anything," they murmured, voice low. "But she's been talking behind your back. You deserve to know." I did not react outwardly. I simply nodded, cataloging the information. The presence of a witness was validation that the threads I had observed were real. The betrayal was not imagined. Later, in the suite where the bridal party gathered, I noticed discrepancies in the guest list. Names that had been mentioned in passing were absent, replaced by others whose presence was carefully calculated. Small notes were tucked into corners of binders, lists of people, instructions, and subtle reminders that the plan had been deliberately curated. The handwriting was familiar. I recognized it immediately as hers. My heart tightened, but I kept my voice and body neutral. To react now would alert her to my awareness, to the fact that I had begun piecing together the truth. Even my fiancé's behavior revealed cracks. He avoided lingering in conversations where the betrayal was most likely to surface, his attention fragmented, his tone measured. When I caught him alone briefly, he offered reassurances, but they felt thin. There was a quiet tension between us, a subtle recognition of unspoken truths. I did not confront him. I did not accuse. I only observed, noting patterns, storing fragments, letting them form a picture in my mind. The culmination of partial exposure came when I found a folder mistakenly left in the corner of the suite. Inside were printed emails, carefully arranged, outlining logistics that were meant to obscure certain actions, messages that confirmed my sister's orchestrated manipulations, the quiet exclusion of people who might reveal her duplicity, and hints of her coordination with her fiancé in ways that were invisible to everyone else. I did not open every email. I did not need to. The folder itself was proof. The system had betrayed her, and in its errors I glimpsed truth. I retreated to the balcony, holding the folder against my chest, staring out at the city below. The wind moved through the space quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though even nature understood the tension I carried. I realized then that the world I had trusted, the family, the friends, the meticulously maintained routine, was already compromised. Yet the power I had always wielded in observation, in restraint, remained intact. I did not shout. I did not accuse. I simply catalogued, understanding that the slow, deliberate revelation of truth was more potent than immediate confrontation. By evening, the contours of the betrayal were clear. Partial exposure had given me a map, a framework, a quiet but undeniable certainty. The system, the witnesses, the fragments of communication, they all pointed to the same reality, I had been manipulated, excluded, and underestimated, and now the evidence existed quietly around me. I understood the stakes, the layers of deception, and the subtle cost it would carry. The tension in my chest was heavy, but my restraint remained. I would wait. I would watch. And when the moment for truth arrived, I would have every detail in its place, cataloged and ready, witnessed in ways no one else could deny. Partial exposure had begun the unraveling, and I was ready. The morning of the wedding dawned gray and quiet, but the tension in the hotel's suite was palpable. Every movement, every gesture carried weight. My sister flitted from room to room, orchestrating final details while her friends hovered close, their smiles polished, rehearsed, and occasionally sharp. I moved among them, invisible but observing, cataloging every subtle signal, every uneven glance. The partial exposure of yesterday had sharpened my perception, and now I could see the patterns fully. The first escalation was almost imperceptible. During hair and makeup, one of her friends, who had been a silent participant in the orchestrated manipulations, whispered something just low enough to be audible only to me. "Careful, she's paying attention now." The words were not a threat, but a recognition. The same friend avoided my gaze afterward, shifting the weight of her posture as if acknowledging that I had begun to see the cracks. It was the first acknowledgement of my awareness, and it carried a quiet power. Later, while arranging the bouquets, I noticed my sister checking her phone more frequently than usual, glancing toward corners of the room where I happened to be. Her laughter, once effortlessly polished, had a brittle edge. When her fiancé approached to adjust a detail, she stiffened, speaking in clipped tones, her voice carrying a subtle warning. The tension between them, previously hidden in the background, was now visible in every slight gesture, every measured glance. Their composure was faltering under the scrutiny of the observation they had never anticipated. By mid-morning, the escalation had spread to other guests. A bridesmaid, previously quiet, hesitated when asked a question, and the uncertainty in her movements betrayed awareness of my scrutiny. Another guest lingered too long near the reception desk, as if weighing whether to intervene in ways I could not yet detect. Even the hotel staff were more alert, responding with a slightly increased caution when I approached. The subtle orchestration I had catalogued over the previous days was now fraying at the edges, a system stretched thin by the presence of someone who refused to remain passive. During the rehearsal, the tension reached a higher pitch. My sister's laughter, previously an effortless mask, now carried a slight sharpness that betrayed impatience. Her jokes, once aimed at maintaining control, faltered under the weight of my quiet observation. I noticed the patterns of omission, who she included, who she ignored, and how carefully she manipulated attention. Her fiancé mirrored her discomfort, avoiding prolonged eye contact, adjusting gestures mid-motion. The fragile stability of the previous days was cracking, and I catalogued each detail in silence. The first overt sign of escalation came when a whispered conversation I had previously overlooked was interrupted by a sudden, forced cheer from my sister. A guest had tried to mention something subtly, but she redirected the conversation immediately, her tone light but her eyes sharp. The message was clear. My scrutiny was no longer invisible. I watched as she orchestrated attention, her body language precise, defensive, calculated. The control she had wielded effortlessly in the past was now reactive, defensive, and strained. I remained quiet, restrained, noting every movement, every glance, every change in tone. Observation had always been my tool, and now it was my armor. I could see the cost of her manipulation in real time, the brittle laughter, the subtle adjustments, the avoidance of eye contact. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface for days was boiling, and the delicate system she had created was fraying. My restraint, once passive, now felt active, a quiet assertion of presence that she could neither name nor counter. By late afternoon, the escalation had reached a personal level. One of her colleagues, unaware of my knowledge, dropped a detail about my sister's arrangements, a minor slip, but enough to confirm what I had been tracking. My sister's eyes flicked toward me immediately, sharp and calculating, measuring my reaction. I did not give her one. I remained calm, neutral, folding the information into my internal record. The psychological pressure she had attempted to exert through subtle exclusion and gaslighting was now mirrored back in quiet observation. The culmination of the day came in the small, almost imperceptible ways. A note left in her suite that was clearly intended to be private, but which I discovered. A phone call that was abruptly ended when I entered the room. Glances exchanged among her friends that revealed unease, the first acknowledgement that my presence mattered. The system she had constructed, the hierarchy of attention, the orchestration of perception, all were straining under the weight of exposure. The power she had wielded so quietly was no longer unchallenged. By evening, I understood the true extent of the escalation. The betrayal, the manipulation, the careful erasure of my presence, everything was now visible, at least to me. The cost of observation had been patience and silence, but it was worth it. The orchestrator was reacting, adjusting, attempting to maintain control in the face of a presence she had underestimated. The tension was heavy, the stakes clear, and yet my restraint remained intact. I did not confront, I did not accuse. I catalogued, I observed, I waited. The quiet, deliberate escalation had begun, and I was ready to follow it wherever it led. By the evening, the hotel suite felt smaller than it had that morning. The air was heavy with perfume, with the hum of conversation, with the tension that had accumulated over days of orchestrated smiles and whispered corrections. I moved quietly through the space, aware of every shift in posture, every glance that lingered too long. My sister's facade had begun to falter in subtle ways, her laughter brittle, her movements precise but strained, and I catalogued each detail with careful restraint. The moral and emotional weight of what I had observed pressed down on me. Partial exposure had revealed fragments of the truth. Escalation had made her manipulations visible, undeniable in their quiet way. I felt the cost in my chest, a dull ache that throbbed with recognition of betrayal, with the knowledge that those I trusted, including my fiancé in some small measure, had been caught in the current of her influence. The realization was heavy. Trust alone could not protect me from the subtle cruelties of deliberate exclusion and gaslighting. During the final moments of rehearsal, a small incident crystallized the moral tension. One of her friends, unaware that I had already pieced together the narrative, made a careless comment, a slight acknowledgement of what had been hidden. My sister's face tightened instantly, a silent warning to the witness, and yet I saw it clearly. My chest constricted, not with anger but with the recognition of the imbalance, the way power had been wielded subtly, invisibly, against me. My usual impulse was to catalogue and wait, and I did so, but the weight of knowing what they all had done pressed against me with relentless pressure. I retreated briefly to the balcony, stepping out into the cool evening air. The city spread below, indifferent, distant. The world moved on, oblivious to the subtleties of manipulation and betrayal that had consumed my days. I could feel the moral and emotional breaking point approaching, not a breakdown, but a recognition that the cost of restraint was growing heavier with each observed gesture. Every slight, every whispered exclusion, every calculated smile, the sum of it pressed against the quiet of my own conscience. Inside, my sister and her collaborators were unaware that I had reached this threshold. They continued their orchestration with a precision that suggested confidence, but confidence was fragile when faced with observation. I noticed her fiancé's avoidance, his careful gestures, the way he mirrored her tension. Even those aligned with her were under subtle stress, their behavior betraying awareness of my presence and understanding. The system itself, which she had relied upon to maintain control, was now reacting to my quiet persistence. I did not confront. I did not demand recognition. I did not accuse. I had learned that confrontation in this environment would reveal little and risk everything. Instead, I allowed the awareness to settle in me, heavy and controlled. Each moment of restraint reinforced my own authority in a subtle way. I could not undo the betrayal, nor could I erase the manipulation that had been carefully deployed. But I could remain present, observant, silent, allowing the consequences of their actions to accumulate without interference. A guest, one of the few not entirely aligned with my sister's orchestration, caught my eye. Their glance was fleeting, but charged with understanding, a subtle acknowledgement that the truth was visible, at least to some. I nodded imperceptibly. No words passed between us. Words were unnecessary. The moral breaking point was not a declaration, it was recognition. It was the quiet acceptance that I had observed the full spectrum of betrayal, that I had catalogued it meticulously, and that I could do nothing overt without compromising the clarity I had achieved. By the time the evening's formalities began, I had made a conscious decision. I would maintain restraint, even as the internal weight of betrayal pressed against me. The emotional cost was real, palpable in the tension that tightened my chest and the quiet ache that lingered in my shoulders. I understood fully that my sister's power, which had been subtle and hidden, was now exposed, but the exposure was not mine to weaponize. My role was observation, cataloging, and endurance. The ethical boundary I had chosen was clear: restraint over reaction, awareness over confrontation. As the room darkened with evening, I positioned myself at the edge of the reception area, silent and still. My sister moved through her guests, orchestrating laughter and conversation, unaware of the quiet authority I now held in the shadows. I felt the weight of moral clarity, of recognition without action, and I understood the psychological cost. To remain restrained was to bear the weight of betrayal fully, without reprieve, without reprisal. In that quiet, restrained acknowledgement, I found a strange equilibrium. The breaking point was not visible, not dramatic, but it existed, a pivot of conscience and awareness. I had seen the truth. I had catalogued it. I had understood the imbalance. And I would endure, quietly watching, waiting, letting the consequences unfold naturally in a world that refused to pause for justice. The morning after the wedding, the hotel was quieter, but the undercurrent of consequence had begun to ripple through the rooms. The orchestrated smiles, the rehearsed gestures, the carefully controlled interactions, all of it had left faint traces, like a shadow clinging to polished surfaces. I moved deliberately through the suite, cataloging every small detail. The way the floral arrangements had shifted overnight, the angles of chairs that had been subtly displaced, the faint tension in the air as if the room itself remembered the night before. The first consequence appeared in subtle gestures from the guests. One of my sister's friends, previously complicit, lingered awkwardly when we passed in the hallway. Their smile was polite, but the tightness around their eyes betrayed unease. Another guest, who had whispered confirmation to me days before, now avoided eye contact with my sister entirely, standing at a distance as if anticipating a misstep. These small signs, so easily missed by anyone unobservant, were evidence that the manipulation was no longer seamless, that the system she had relied upon had begun to unravel. I noticed my sister's movements more closely than anyone else could. She flitted from corner to corner, directing instructions to staff, adjusting floral displays, straightening linens, all with practiced efficiency, but with an undercurrent of urgency that had not been present before. Her control, which had seemed absolute, was now reactive, defensive, constrained by the awareness that someone, me, was watching every gesture, every interaction, every minor correction. The subtle consequences of her orchestration were now visible in the strain of her body and the flicker in her eyes. By mid-morning, even her fiancé could not escape the repercussions. He moved through the room with a measured carefulness that suggested internal recognition of the previous day's truths. A gentle tremor in his composure betrayed awareness that the meticulous systems he had relied upon were failing. In small, almost imperceptible ways, he mirrored her tension, his habitual calm giving way to micro-adjustments of posture, of speech, of attention. The consequence was not dramatic. It was quiet, invisible to most, yet undeniable to an observer like myself. The administrative details revealed the next layer. Emails and messages, which had been previously orchestrated to conceal intentions, were now accessed by other staff members who were unaligned with her manipulation. Small disclosures emerged, notes left carelessly, scheduling errors, confirmations that contradicted earlier claims. Each revealed her orchestration for what it was, a carefully constructed illusion, fragile in its dependency on obedience and silence. And now, with cracks appearing, even the systems she had counted on were failing. During the reception, I observed subtle reactions in her friends. Their laughter was less synchronized, their attentiveness less assured. One bridesmaid dropped a note, hastily picking it up as I passed, but the slip had already exposed fragments of coordination that contradicted the narrative my sister had maintained. The truth, once hidden in plain sight, was quietly emerging. No one had to speak loudly. The consequences were self-evident in the fractured gestures, the hurried corrections, the fleeting expressions of anxiety. I remained restrained. I did not confront. I did not accuse. I did not allow satisfaction to intrude, even silently. Observation was my power, and it revealed the unfolding consequences without intervention. Every guest, every staff member, every participant in her orchestrated world, now subtly recalibrating, was evidence that truth, when witnessed carefully, carried weight without spectacle. By evening, the consequences were clear in the smallest spaces. The strategic arrangements no longer held, the subtle exclusions no longer functioned seamlessly, and the fragile dominance my sister had relied upon had begun to crumble in ways that were quiet, cumulative, and undeniable. Even the hotel staff, previously obedient to the orchestration, began to behave independently, responding to cues I had noticed but that had previously gone unheeded. The systems, the witnesses, the fragments of proof, they all converged to confirm what I had known. Her control was slipping. And yet the fallout was not dramatic. There were no confrontations, no public humiliations, no speeches of revelation. The consequences unfolded quietly, imperceptibly to anyone who was not watching closely. For me, it was enough. The betrayal had been catalogued, the manipulation observed, and now the consequences were self-evident. My restraint remained intact, heavy with moral clarity, silent with understanding. I knew the truth was undeniable. The orchestrated world my sister had built, her control over perception, her subtle dismissals, her calculated manipulations, was failing. And I, silent, restrained, and observant, had borne witness to it all. The consequences were unfolding, and no further action was needed. Observation alone had shifted the balance. The room was dim, softened by evening light filtering through sheer curtains. The wedding had ended hours ago, but the residue of the day lingered, scattered programs on tables, a few half-empty glasses, and the faint scent of perfume that had clung to the air all day. I stood near the window, looking out at the city below, tracing shadows that moved slowly across the streets. Everything was still, yet heavy. My sister had returned to her room, smiling politely at a few remaining guests, her energy carefully reconstructed, as if nothing had changed. Her world, meticulously curated, persisted, but I knew differently. The subtle fractures were visible only to someone who had been watching, cataloging, waiting. Her control, the hierarchy of attention, the exclusion, the whispered manipulations, they had all left traces too small for anyone else to notice, but I carried them. I gathered my things quietly, leaving the suite without fanfare. No words passed between us, no acknowledgement, no confrontation. There was no victory here, only observation, the culmination of patience and awareness. The truth existed in the fragments, in the systems that had faltered, in the subtle unease that still clung to her friends, and in the careful notes and messages I had preserved. Outside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint hum of city life. I walked slowly, letting the quiet weight settle over me. There would be no speeches, no revenge, no validation from anyone else. The consequences were already visible, unfolding silently, and I had borne witness. The betrayal had been catalogued, the manipulations seen, the cost understood. As I turned a corner and disappeared into the evening, I felt the heavy calm of resolution. Not triumph, not relief, not recognition, just the quiet aftermath. Everything had shifted subtly, irrevocably, and I carried the knowledge alone. And that was enough.